Um, Thanks to all of you who are joining us. Really excited to be here today for our webinar on Electrify 101, the big solution to climate change. My name is Joe Wachunas. I work with Electrify Now. I'm also a program manager at the nonprofit Fourth that promotes transportation electrification, and also write for the blog Clean Technica. So I'm really excited about the topic for tonight. For today, excuse me, on electrification. I'm excited about our panelists. So a real quick word on our this coalition that's supporting and putting on this webinar. We have, you can see at the bottom of the screen, we have five organizations: Passive House Northwest, PAE, Solar Oregon, Community Energy Project, and Electrify Now that are putting on this series of webinars together. We're really excited about that, and we want to throw this out to everyone. If you're interested in electrification and want to be part of this group, we welcome individuals, organizations. So please join us. It's a really easy lift. All that's required is just once a month meeting and help promoting the content. So please join us if you're interested. Great. A couple words. We're going to be doing a monthly webinar on deep dive on all these topics associated with electrification. We've got the Electrify 101 today, induction cooking next month, where we're hopefully going to have a chef cooking live with induction, say bye-bye to gas in the kitchen. We've got electrification and equity in October. And then we're going to be talking a lot today about electrification technologies like heat pump water heaters and heat pumps. And there will be deep dives on all of these topics, so stay tuned. Make sure you're on our email list going forward. This coalition is doing this all in volunteer time, so we want to raise money for something good, and we're really excited about this Electrify Everyone Fund. You might have noticed it when you signed up in Eventbrite. Basically, we partnered with Community Energy Project that's been doing work retrofitting homes and weatherizing homes for decades. And this program works that if they have an old gas water heater in the communities they serve, they will be able to replace it with these funds with a heat pump water heater, so a super efficient heat pump water heater. So we've just started this program. We've already got enough funds for about 20 water heaters. In our webinar donations alone, we had $160 donated. So that's 1/5 of the money we need to donate a water heater. So if you, while I'm blabbing on in the beginning, go ahead to the website that we put in the chat room, Electrify Everyone Fund, donate $5, $10 to this great fund, and we'll keep you updated with the status of how many electric heat pump water heaters we've replaced for folks. So we're super excited about that. Another quick plug, this is Hang Drive for Climate Change Week. In the chat, you'll find information on why this is such an important technique to save energy. And if you take a picture of your clothes hang drying and post it to social media, you can win great prizes. So please go ahead and do that. Our member Solar Oregon is leading that one up. So today, a quick schedule. I'll just give a 5-minute intro, and then I'll introduce our guest tonight, and they'll do a deep dive into Electrification 101. Some of the questions that we want to answer today are: why is electrification such an important solution? Is our grid clean? What about natural gas? Can renewable energy be used for everything to power our entire lives? And what are the benefits of electrification for homeowners, and how do we do it? For a very high top-level view on where our carbon emissions come from and why we're inspired to electrify, you can see here that burning fossil fuels is the #1 source of carbon emissions in our country, and most industrialized countries look like this. Around 3/4 of the emissions come from burning fossil fuels for electricity, transportation, and heat. In Multnomah County, it's 96%. We don't have much agriculture here. So lots of our emissions come from, vast majority of our emissions come from burning fossil fuels. And our household emissions are around 60% from burning fuels for these three uses. And rather than this being an overwhelming statistic, we feel empowered by this because we have a lot of control over of how we drive our cars, the kind of fuel we use to heat our homes and heat our water, and the kind of electricity that we buy. And so we have a lot of control over that. Whereas with stuff we buy and with food that we eat, we're trying to do our best, but we're at the mercy of big systems. So there's that's an empowering message to us. One other thing we like to show for what a low-hanging fruit this electrification is, there's in the suite that of choices that we have for electrification, we we have all these options. We've got recycling and eating less meat and getting efficient shower heads, and all these are important. But electrification is some of the lowest hanging fruit. And you can see here by this stat, 1 gallon of gas is saving 25 pounds of CO2. So when you make that switch to an electric car and you want to keep it your entire life, how many gallons of gas is that? So we just want to highlight the importance on CO2 and the fact that burning fossil fuels is the primary cause of our climate crisis. And the great news is we have these incredible technologies of wind and solar that are cost effective, and we can switch to them quickly. And we combine that with these energy efficient electrical appliances like heat pump water heaters and induction stoves, and we can run virtually all our lives on electricity. This just gives you an idea of the last 10 years of how solar and wind have dramatically declined in cost to be the lowest cost producers of electricity. So out of these trends, this philosophy is formed: electrify everything. We can power all of our lives on wind and sun. It can supply all of our energy needs. And so that's what our panelists are going to be talking today about. Let me introduce them. Karina Hirschberg, she's a lead engineer at PAE. Karina has over 12 years of experience in innovative electrical systems design, including research on renewable energy development, green building methods, and eco-districts. You can read about some of her projects here. Karina is going to be talking about giving a high-level view of both how the grid is getting cleaner and and some of the hidden emissions on natural gas. And then we will be having, our next speaker will be Brian Stewart. He's the founder of Electrify Now. He has over 35 years of experience in product design and manufacturing. And before retiring from Nike, he was vice president of sustainable innovation, where he led programs to reduce waste and cut carbon emissions. And he founded Electrify Now to help educate homeowners on how to dramatically reduce their carbon emissions through electrification. And Brian will be talking a little bit about the individual use cases, how we can make these change, what that looks like, and how it's good for individual homeowners and renters. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Karina.
All right, let me get my screen shared here. All right, look good?
Yep.
Looks good. All right. Okay. I got myself all oriented here. All right. Okay. Well, hello, everyone. Yes, I'm Karina. So I'm an associate with PAE. I'm an electrical engineer, but I work in kind of two of our groups, electrical, as well as our building analysis and modeling group. And for those who aren't familiar with us, PAE, we are a building engineering firm. We do mechanical, electrical, plumbing, technology, lighting, and then the building analysis and modeling. And myself, as well as many others, are at PAE specifically because of our very deep commitment to really advancing the sustainable movement within the built environment. And so we say that our vision is to help solve the planet's energy and water challenges, and we very much view the electrification movement as one of the biggest levers that we have to help with that energy challenge and helping to solve that. So the why. So I think, as Joe kind of mentioned, that there's the why and the how is how I always break it out of electrification, is why are we doing it, and then how do we do it? And the how is the part where we need to spend most of our time doing it, really, is figuring out how to implement it right. But I do believe that there's value in starting first with the why and kind of thinking about it so that way we understand why we're doing it. It can help be a motivator and help inspire, and it can also help us making decisions, right, as we're making decisions on how to do the how. Understanding the context in which the electrification movement is in, I think can be really beneficial with that. So I will geek out with you guys all today on the why for a little bit. All right, so the kind of the fundamental concept of the why is this concept called the greening of the grid. And what this essentially says is that natural gas is a fossil fuel. It's a fossil fuel today, therefore it has emissions. It's going to be a fossil fuel tomorrow, therefore it's going to have emissions. There's no path to full decarbonization of natural gas. It will always have emissions. Electricity, on the other hand, although it does have emissions today, we are seeing the technologies that lead it to be zero emissions or zero carbon are really, their time has come. I mean, as Joe mentioned, the price of all the renewables and storage has come down so much, and our ability to integrate them, I mean, it's their time has arrived. And so on the grid, we do have a path towards decarbonization to a point where we could get to a zero emissions or zero carbon state. And so what this means for us with the electrification movement is that a building or a vehicle, by connecting to the grid, we then also have a path to decarbonization purely by the fact that we're able to benefit from what's happening on the grid. So even if we do nothing else, we're also moving to decarbonization along with the grid. And so that's this idea, is that the electrification movement is that, you know what, let's hitch our wagon to the thing that is moving to zero carbon. And so that's a nice idea, right? But it's always good to kind of check that, right? It's a great theory. But what I will be kind of diving into today is sort of the data behind that, and confirming that this is actually what's happening, and it's not just a nice idea, but it is in fact an actual reality. And so a bit of what I'm sharing today is kind of my own research journey that I've done over the last couple of years through this, and just some key questions that need to be answered, so that we can all feel comfortable that we're doing the right thing, we're heading the right direction. And so the way I kind of framed it for, again, kind of my own research on it was, the first one is there still a place for natural gas, right? Natural gas has been called the clean burning fuel, or the bridging fuel, right? It was the bridge between coal and renewables. And so is there still a place for it? What does that transition look like for it to be achieving what we're hoping it's going to achieve? And then, of course, are the grids getting cleaner, right? This whole premise that they're getting cleaner, let's confirm that that is actually happening, and understand what that looks like. And then last is, how will the new loads be supported? And this is one that I get this question a lot, is like, well, if all the buildings and if all the cars go electric, are the grids going to have to put on new fossil fuels to meet it, right? Because we don't want to move natural gas from one side of the table to the other side of the table. We really want to move it out of the system. And so answering that question of, if all these new loads come on, how do the grids meet it, is sort of the last key one that we want to touch on. So I'm going to start off first with a look at, let's go through natural gas. So first, kind of the fundamentals, right? Natural gas, that's not really what it is, right? It's methane. It's CH4 is what natural gas is. So it's methane, which is a greenhouse gas. And greenhouse gases in the right quantities are good, right? It what's makes the planet livable. Greenhouse gases in the wrong quantities are bad. It's what's potentially going to make the planet no longer livable. And of course, with the climate crisis, we are well into the bad category, and accelerating in that direction. And so understanding what methane's role has in the climate crisis is really fundamental to kind of knowing how we need to address it. So there's a lot of different contributors to the climate crisis, right, and a lot of different greenhouse gases. And so one of the things the scientific community has done is to try and create a normalizing factor, so that way we can evaluate all these different components against each other and do some sort of, stack up to understand, where the biggest contributors are coming from, where are they coming from, and that we can do, kind of strategic planning around it. And so that metric that's used is called global warming potential, or GWH, or excuse me, GWP, you see sometimes in articles. And what that tries to do is take all these different chemical compounds and normalizes them back to CO2. And so with that, you come up with an equivalent, a CO2 equivalent. And in the case of methane, the way that the global warming potential is calculated is they had to set a constant for time. And so they put it at 100 years. And so on that 100-year global warming potential, methane, it's about a 1 to 30 ratio. So 1 unit of methane is equivalent to 30 units of CO2. The problem is that methane actually has a very short shelf life. And so what this does is that by putting it on a 100-year time scale, we actually end up kind of diluting its impact. We don't really see what it is on the short time. And when we think with some of the big goals that are out there right now, Paris Agreement and the IPCC's 2030 goals, it's 2030 and 2050 are the timelines that we're looking at. So it's actually that short timeline. We actually care very deeply about that, because that's the one that we're trying to tackle to avoid, some of the feedback loops and some of the other factors that could happen. And so there's a growing movement to have a second global warming potential metric, which would be set at a 20-year time constant. So that way we can really understand what is going to be the biggest contributors in that short time frame. And when we do that, all of a sudden methane jumps 3x. So now all of a sudden we're looking at a unit of methane is, between 80 and 90 units of CO2. And this matters because it impacts how it stacks up in the overall list of things that we're trying to tackle. So this graphic here is from, so the EPA does a GHG, an emissions accounting every so many years, and they kind of stack up what's our total, where are our emissions coming from within the United States. And there's other ones that are on here that have been removed from this for clarity. But you can kind of see here, CO2 is the big one, right? And then methane comes in next. But this is using that 100-year global warming potential factor. When we move to the 20-year one, all of a sudden methane becomes a much bigger piece of that pie, right? So all of a sudden it's kind of a say, oh wow, that's, maybe we want to be taking that probably pretty seriously. That's all of a sudden how that stacks up against, CO2. And so again, kind of understanding, what we're looking at is really important when we look at how big of a deal is natural gas. And just to be clear, like, there are natural sources of natural gas or methane, right? We hear this a lot, like, oh well, there's natural sources. Yes, there are natural sources, that's true, and there are other sources as well, right? Cows kind of get the bad rap on methane as well. But when you add them all up, the energy sector contribution is about the same as the one that comes out of agriculture. And so, again, it's not to say that these other sources aren't ones that we also need to be taking seriously, but it's just, again, remembering that there's kind of three, or I guess in this case, two big chunks of the pie that we need to be taking seriously, and oil and gas industry is one of those big chunks. So what does that all mean for the built environment? So buildings we kind of consider it as three main sources of greenhouse gas emissions. The one that we're going to be talking about today, and this is again when we get really deep and geek out really hard on building emissions, but the one we're talking about today is operational emissions, which is related to the operation of the building. And that's what we're dealing with today with the discussion about electricity and natural gas, is trying to tackle that specific element of emissions within the built environment. And so the way that we do this, the way that we calculate this, is we take our total units of energy and then we multiply them by emissions factor, and then that tells us what our total emissions are. So if you're trying to figure out, your carbon footprint of your lifestyle or of your home, right, that's essentially what some of those calculators that are out there are doing, and that's what you can do yourself as well, is you take your units of energy, multiply emissions factor, and then you get that, what your total total budget is. The problem with natural gas is that the emissions factors that are out there and published right now are low, and there's a mounting body of evidence that's starting to come out as we're starting to be able to do more measurement and more field analysis, is that they're extremely low, and so that we've probably been undercounting them for quite a while. And that matters because then that means our totals have been off, and as we do our own analysis on our own homes, our totals have probably been low. And the reason for this is that what they're starting to find is that there is a leak issue within the supply chain. So if we look at natural gas supply chain, it is a huge, complex, long, with lots of moving parts supply chain. And as we think about it, kind of the more moving parts you have, the more likely things are going to break, right? That very much applies to these very long kind of supply chains. And what we're starting to find is that there are more leaks happening than we are aware of, and that are being accounted in these overall totals. And in fact, it's potentially just, they call them the super emitters. A few very large leaks are potentially what's really, really tipping the scales, and it's maybe as much as 50% of total emissions are coming from 5% of leaks. And so if those 5% of leaks aren't being reported, then those emissions are sort of these phantom emissions that are out there, that are part of the supply chain, but are not showing up in these emissions rates that we're using. This is an example, and if folks are interested in kind of learning more about this, I do recommend, there's been a couple of, New York Times has had a couple of good pieces in the last couple of years. They have a very well done interactive piece that came out late last year that I recommend folks looking at. But this one was an interesting one. It was a leak that happened in Ohio, I think it was about 2 years ago. And it was known to be a bad leak. They ended up having to evacuate some of the homes in the area, but it wasn't considered to be a really catastrophic leak. But what ended up happening is there just happened to have been a satellite that had been recently launched specifically with the purpose of monitoring the globe for methane leaks. And so they were able to use instrumentation on the satellite, train it on the specific site, and do an actual measured analysis of what the leak was. And what they ended up finding is that based on the measurement, it was one of the largest leaks ever recorded in US history, which is kind of concerning for two different reasons. One is that it was this huge, it's a huge leak, right? That's terrible for the climate, but then also it was in recorded history, right? They just happened to be able to have the equipment and be able to do this measurement and be able to do this analysis, right? Which then kind of says, well, gosh, how many others happened that didn't get measured, right? That's really concerning. And that was kind of where I'm saying is that there's as more data is starting to come in, they're finding that pretty much anytime they look through the supply chain, they're finding leaks. And so this has probably been going on for a long time, and we just haven't been aware of it, and we haven't been aware of the extent of it. And this matters, right? Because again, we think of natural gas as being the clean burning fuel, right? It was the bridging from coal to renewables. That has been changing, right? As we have more of the leaks and we start to factor in things like fracking and the impacts of that, right? Is that comparison as though it's better than coal, it starts to get a little bit murkier. And what some of the analysis are starting to show is that a leak rate of about 3%, we start to, and this is of the whole supply chain, we maybe start to cross over from it being less damaging than coal to maybe as damaging as coal in terms of a global warming, standpoint. And so the question really is, well, what's the real leak rate? And the problem is again, they just don't know. Nobody really knows. I've seen estimates that were at like 2.8, and I've seen them go as high as 6, right? So we're either kind of right at the cusp or we've already crossed it, but we just don't know because these aren't being measured as well as we need them to be to really answer that question. So if we go back to our stack up, right, of how does methane stack up against CO2, and we have our 20-year global warming, right, so we've adjusted for the time factor. If we then try to take a guess or a pass at the leak rate, and again, I've seen anything from the kind of the EPA's rates. I've seen it as 2x increases or 3x increases. I took a more conservative and just did a 1.5x. If we account for leaks, right, once again, we see it's like, gosh, that's really starting to stack up, right? So it's like CO2 and methane are both really big deals. Maybe we should be dealing with both of them. And again, this is important because it's just as we start to tackle this stuff, understanding its contribution, is important for us to understand, so we make sure that we're kind of putting our efforts in the right place as we try and make positive progress. And of course, the leak issue, this is actually not new information to those in the industry. It's something that RMI and Environmental Defense Fund have been working on for years and years, really trying to get policies in place. And they were quite successful for a while. There was some really good regulations that were put in place. And then there was an administration change, of course, and then they've pretty much all been rolled back, removed, or canceled. And actually, there was a great article recently that was talking about one of the recent policy changes that happened, and there was a quote in there that if you read it out of context, you would have thought that it would have come from an RMI or something like that. And it was actually from the president of Shell, and they were talking about how upset they were at the policy rollbacks. And you'd be surprised to hear it from Shell, but it was even the oil and gas majors were against a lot of these regulation rollbacks because it kind of goes against their own climate commitments, and it really undoes kind of their PR efforts around natural gas as being a clean burning fuel. So this is a pretty interesting one politically, is that it's both the environmental groups and some of the oil and gas majors have been against these rollbacks. And then if we look at the state level, there's also, we're seeing some pretty interesting activities. the electrification movement from a policy standpoint has really, really taken off in California. I think there are over 30 cities and jurisdictions now have some sort of policy around electrification, either for new construction or major renovations, of trying to shift everybody to electric only services. The oil and gas industry has obviously taken note of that movement and has started to work very swiftly in the rest of the country to try and prevent a similar shift from happening. And unfortunately, they have been successful in a number of states. There has been bans passed that ban requirements to go all electric. So cities no longer have the option to put in electrification policies. They're required to offer both natural gas and electricity in it. And there's a number of others that are considering it as well. And then just kind of a heads up in the Northwest, we haven't had any cities try to do it yet. There was some discussion around it in a couple cities in Washington, and they were kind of met with pretty swift pushback. So there's definitely kind of a PR campaign that's bubbling up in sort of reaction to some of the electrification stuff. And I just mention it because I think it's good to just be aware as stuff starts to hit the media, you know, one way or the other, of just knowing that that's kind of where some of that pushback is coming from and where that money is coming from, is in trying to kind of slow down or stop the electrification movement. And it generally comes from oil and gas funding. And I'm not going to talk about this one very much because, as Joe mentioned, there's going to be a whole webinar about it. But it is interesting that there's a number of studies that have been coming out in the last maybe 5 years or so around cooking and the air quality problems with natural gas in homes. And this can be a really interesting one because, you know, sometimes folks the environmental stuff, it's not as much of it doesn't quite hit as home quite as closely to them, but indoor air quality and health of the family, especially kind of with everything that's going on right now with COVID, making sure that people's respiratory health is really being prioritized. The natural gas cooking, it turns out, has really negative impacts to indoor air quality, and there's been studies again, unfortunately showing increased rates of asthma amongst children, and so in homes that had natural gas cooking. And so there can be really important health benefits from moving away from natural gas in the home as well. And I'll just kind of end this section with touching quickly on a concept called renewable natural gas, because I do hear this come up quite frequently when we talk about trying to move natural gas out of buildings, or kind of the environmental impact of natural gas. And renewable natural gas, I take a lot of exception with the renewable part. I think reused would be a better R word. But what it does is it is essentially trying to tap into some of those other methane sources that we saw from landfills and then agricultural-based ones, capturing that methane and then using that to in the natural gas mix. And so instead of extracting it from the earth, using it from these other sources. And I think it's an interesting concept, and I think that I'm interested to see where it goes. But my caveat that I want to warn about is that I've heard it said as like, oh, it's okay, we can put natural gas on buildings. Renewable natural gas is coming, right? It's going to be right here. The problem is that it's a very small amount. Will replace a very, very small amount. It is not a one-for-one replacement. So interesting technology. It does not fix the problem though. And it's not going to be used in like homes and buildings. It has very specific applications that it can be used in. So the punchline of all that is that natural gas has emissions today. They're actually probably higher than we think they are, and they likely are going to get worse over time. And so kind of that initial premise of like emissions today, emissions tomorrow, it's actually probably worse. It's worse emissions today and even worse emissions tomorrow on the natural gas side. So how are things going on the grids, right? This is the kind of the other flip of it. So at the national level, we see emissions are coming down. That's good. And then in terms of new installations, it's predominantly renewables at this point. They really are very cost effective. It's the right decision environmentally, and then also the right decision economically for utilities to do. And so that's most of what we're seeing coming online. I will mention that grid emissions and the cleanliness of grids do vary region to region. And so just kind of being aware of that. And even along the West Coast, we have quite a bit of variation. We have some very, very clean grids and some that are a little bit dirtier. And so the kind of the stage and the where they are in the transition might change a little bit depending on where you're located. But generally it's coming from the state mandates. And so this is an interesting one for us to kind of watch from a policy standpoint as, you know, as citizens and as voters. Oregon's a little bit less aggressive than Washington and California, but we're still trying to get there. So a 45% reduction by 2035, 80% by 2050. It'd be nice to see that one maybe get a little more aggressive here in the future, but we'll see. So our two main utilities in Oregon, right, PGE and Pacific Power. So how are they doing, right? We want to make sure that they are getting cleaner. And the good news is that they are. So that's, from an electrification standpoint, that's what we want to see, right? They are on track to meet those targets that are requirements that are set by the state. PGE is going to get there a little bit faster. Actually, I think they're scheduled to hit the 80% mark by 2040. And Pacific Power is an interesting one because they're actually one of the dirtiest grids on the West Coast. Had a lot of coal, but they have. Even they're accelerating it. This is kind of showing their plan that was in 2017 versus 2019, and they're actually moving faster than originally. So that's been really exciting to see, because again, they're one of the dirtier ones. So to see them cleaning up is again, moves all in the right direction for us looking at the electrification movement. One interesting little caveat in this is that when we look at the utilities, and what their plans are for decarbonization. There's kind of the big ones that we all know about, right? It's wind and it's solar, and then storage is now the other one. But there's one more, and this one is called grid interactive buildings, or load flexibility, sometimes called demand response, we sometimes see. And this is the one where us as individuals, as homeowners, can have a lot of influence. And what this says is that it's not just where your energy is coming from in terms of whether you have solar panels on your house or whatnot, but it's when you're using energy and trying to avoid peak times, because that's actually the part that's hardest to solve in the grids, is the peak time. And that's where we're most likely to see potentially new fossil fuel resources come online, or when they get used, is during these peak times. So the really hot day, right, when everybody turns their air conditioning on, right? That's the one that we have a really active role to play in, which is it's kind of interesting because it doesn't get talked about as much, again, as some of the renewables and the storage, but it can be a really impactful one, and it's one that comes with the electrification movement. A lot of the devices that are part of it, the heat pumps and the EV chargers, and that they actually have the software in them that allow you to do some of these adjustments to avoid these peak times and avoid those really dirty resources from coming on. And I'll give an example here. PGE has a program that as residential customers you can participate in, and you just get a text message the day before that says, tomorrow is going to be a peak time. If you could reduce your usage between 5 and 8 p.m. And it's right now, it's all very low tech. It's you just kind of turn your lights off and eat sandwiches for dinner instead of cooking. But the event that they had in June was one of the first ones that they had, with these really minor adjustments that everybody made that were pretty much unnoticeable. I mean, my family didn't even notice that I was doing anything, was enough to equal 11 megawatts of reduced load, which meant there was half of what they call a natural gas peaker, which is one of the dirtiest sources of electricity generation, an equivalent of half of one of those, which is amazing. It was all these little tiny incremental, elements all added up to something that was actually really big. And so that's kind of an exciting one. Again, that electrification movement is that we have this chance to participate not only in, cleaning up our homes, but then also participating in some of this bigger, the whole grid decarbonizing, right? We have a chance to play a role in that really big movement. And I think I'm running out of time here, but I did play around with the numbers. I couldn't help myself. I did my own home on this, and I actually do have natural gas in my house. I moved in my house, bought my house about 10 years ago. It was still on heating oil. We had a tank in the garage. And about 3 weeks after we moved in, it was a huge cold snap and the furnace died. And we had to make a very quick decision. And I at the time was like, oh, natural gas is the clean burning fuel. And there was a whole bunch of incentives available. And so we installed natural gas on our house. And of course, now here I am 10 years later looking at how to exchange it all over and starting to put that plan together of how to get myself onto being all electric. And so I ran my own numbers. And what was interesting is that today, if I were to make the switch over automatically using the EPA's low emissions rate, I'm already lower emissions if I was all electric. If we use that adjusted rate for the 20 years, the shift changes even more. And then if we account for leaks, even more. And then if we move forward 5 years, I'm a PGE customer, and we look at what PGE's plan is for their own emissions and what their emissions decreases are, those changes happen. I mean, the differences are even more striking. And so it's really, you know, the single biggest thing that my family can do is to, you know, move forward with our plans to switch out our various systems. We're probably going to do the hot water heater first, and then we're going to move on to the furnace next. And that's kind of what my family's plan on it is. There's other benefits we did not get a chance to touch on today. Resiliency is one of them. I do want to mention that because that is something that's available with electrification that is not with natural gas. And so there's kind of, again, that dual benefit of environmental benefits as well, but then we also see resiliency benefits with homes that are moving to electrification. So the punchline in all of this, right, is that natural gas is getting dirtier. The grids are getting cleaner. They're getting cleaner faster. We've already made that cutover where it's better to be all electric now than natural gas. That transition has already happened in our region as we compare, you know, our utilities to natural gas, and then it's just going to continue to accelerate. All right. I think I'm all out of time.
Cool.
So I'll hand it over.
Thanks so much, Karina. Thanks. So we put Karina's email in the chat, and we will. Oh, she's got it right here. Perfect. Thanks. And I think you'll be seeing a lot of Karina at our future deep dive webinars as well. So as Brian is getting his slides loaded up, I'll just remind you, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat. We'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for questions at the end of the presentation. Brian, if you're ready, go ahead and take it away.
Great. Are you able to see the screen there? Joe?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. And I wanted to start off by just reminding people of this slide that Joe showed earlier about 60% of our home energy coming from, from our home emissions coming from burning fossil fuels for electricity, transportation, and heat. And what I'm going to be talking about today is what we can do as homeowners to be part of this transition to clean energy. You know, Karina did a great job of showing us the grid's getting cleaner, which is awesome. We're going to be talking about ways to even go to help accelerate the grid to get cleaner in the choices we make in our homes. The awesome thing about this slide, like Joe mentioned earlier, why it's cause for optimism is that black circle we have control. We can, as homeowners, make that 60% go to zero through the choices we make for the large appliances in our homes. And that's really what we're going to be talking about. Whereas these other two over here, the stuff we buy and the food we eat, yes, we can help to make these go smaller, but for the most part, these are out of our control. It relies on corporations and farms to increase their sustainable practices. So let's talk about what we can control. And I want to start with, okay, sorry, I'm in the wrong place. I'm having to advance here quickly, sorry. Okay, let's start with, you know, just think about what you have in your own home. I did this in my house, and it occurred to me one day I've got all these devices in my home that burn fossil fuels. Everything from the stove that we cook on, the furnace, the water heater. We have 2 cars, we're a typical American family. Our lawnmower, barbecue, all these things burn fossil fuels. And when you add up the cumulative emissions from these things, it's over 20 tons a year for a typical American household. And I've done the numbers for Oregon and for America. They're not vastly different. It's a little bit better here actually than many places because our electricity is a little cleaner, but over 20 tons per year for a typical home. And when you think about how much we spend on that, This is another number that's kind of invisible to most of us because we get monthly bills, we get occasional bills with going to the gas station, but when you add it all up, we typically spend about $4,000 per year per household for a typical household on our energy bills, and really all that money for the most part is going to fossil fuels. So $4,000 per year per household. You multiply that by 126 million households in the United States, that's $500 billion that people like us spend on energy every year. And this is not corporations and businesses, this is just homeowners, apartment dwellers, renters, people like us. As a reference number, there was $55 billion last year spent on clean energy investment. So roughly 500 billion, which is, you can really think of it as funding climate change. I don't want to make people feel guilty, but it's just a fact. Our energy dollars are funding climate change, and 55 billion was spent on solutions to avoid that. So what if we could switch that? What if we could use our household energy dollars to fund the solution rather than continuing to fund the problem? And what if doing that made our lives better? What if it was actually saved us money on our energy costs? Well, the good news is that both these things are possible. We can shift our money to the solution rather than the problem. And when we do that, we're going to enjoy a lot of benefits immediately in terms of better life. So that's what we're really going to talk about. And that's why this Electrify thing is really exciting, because it has this big benefit of climate change, but it's also going to make your life better, and it's going to save you money. If you did all these things that we're going to talk about, you would, rather than spending $4,000 a year on energy costs, you would be spending more like $3,000. Your indoor air quality would be better, lots of other benefits that we're going to talk about. So basically we talk about it in three chunks. The first thing, and in some ways it's the most important one, and fortunately it's the easiest one, is you need to clean up your electric supply. And Karina talked about the grid getting cleaner, which is fantastic, but you can actually make it even cleaner for your house if you want to. We're going to talk about that. Once you've done that, you need to start thinking about, the opportunity is to start thinking about all the devices we have in our homes and connect them to electricity rather than fossil fuels. The big ones are furnaces and water heaters. We're going to talk about that. And then you need to start thinking about transportation and specifically your cars. So we're going to do these one at a time. Electric supply, the first one. And as Karina mentioned, even with our current calculations, electricity is a huge part of our emissions in this country. It's about 25%. The grid's getting cleaner, so this is going down, but it's still a big chunk. For a typical household in Oregon, that equates to about 3.3 tons per year for a typical Oregon home, just for the electricity that you get through the cables, so to speak. The interesting thing here is in Oregon, all of us have access to clean renewable energy directly through our utilities. A lot of you on the call may know this already, but many people don't, and they're surprised to know this. So I make sure I hammer this because it's so easy and important. But all of us, if you're a PGE customer or a Pacific Power customer, you can go online to your account, select the Green Source Power plan if you're a PGE consumer, or the Blue Sky plan if you're Pacific Power, and you will be getting 100% renewable energy essentially for your share. So what that means is your dollars that you spend on electricity now will go to clean energy generation. Instead of being sent to buy coal and natural gas, all that money will go to buying clean energy from solar and wind, and it's verified through this Green E certification program, so you can be confident that it's legit. That's going to cost you a couple extra bucks a month. It's going to be something like $5 to $10 per month for a typical home. But what that means is you're going to get clean energy in your home, and you can think of that as saving or avoiding 3.3 tons a year. There's other ways to do this. You can put solar panels on your roof, and I'm a big fan if your house is situated in the right place, if you have south-facing roof, if you got not too many overhanging trees. This is a really good way to go, but it doesn't work for everyone. And it also involves, some kind of upfront capital costs that some people, it's difficult for some people. But it's a good plan if you can do it. It's going to save you money in the long run. Even here in Oregon, which people think of as cloudy, it still works here. Well, and we're going to go into more of this in detail in some of our subsequent webinars. The other exciting thing that's happening just now is community solar. I'm a big fan of this because if solar doesn't work on your roof, you can tap into a solar installation right here in our area. There's a bunch of them going up in the Willamette Valley right now. Oregon Shines is the first one to be online, and I'm a big fan of Oregon Shines. They have a great website that explains community solar, all the benefits to you personally, which is about a 5% savings on your energy bill, but also to the community, because there's some great community benefits, particularly to low-income subscribers. So I'm a big fan of this. Check it out on OregonShines.com. Regardless of which of those solutions you do, you're going to be saving 3 tons or avoiding 3 tons of emissions. You're going to be helping to finance new clean energy generation, which means that you're accelerating the cleanliness of the grid. You're making the grid cleaner through the money that you spend. And it adds up. I mean, these voluntary actions are one of the biggest things that's driving clean energy generation in the United States. And importantly, now you've got this clean energy and you can start to power everything in your life from that instead of fossil fuels, which is what we're going to talk about next. And this is not necessarily in order. You could do transportation first if that works for you. But let's talk about electrifying your home. As Karina said, we've been kind of sold this idea that natural gas is clean and efficient. I think we've grown up with this whole idea of the clean blue flame, bridge fuels, all this stuff. Karina just talked about why that's suspect. But even with the current accounting, which is very conservative, and it's the version that she showed that shows the least impact from natural gas. Even with that really conservative view, it's still 25% of the emissions here in the United States. And if you use that more extreme view that she talked about, it could be as much as 50% of our emissions come from natural gas, because it could easily be double what we're currently counting. So keep that in mind. But if you're a homeowner, what that translates to, because most of us here in Oregon use natural gas. Now, around for heating, that's differs in different parts of the company. In fact, we had a question from a friend of ours who's in Nevada who is on propane. Propane, actually a little bit worse, I'm sorry to say, than natural gas. But regardless, electricity everywhere is better than natural gas. And if you look at your furnace, it's going to be about 3 tons that a typical furnace here in Oregon produces in terms of emissions every year. And a water heater, surprisingly, is almost as bad. It's 2 tons. So those are the 2 big ones in your life. There's other things like your stove and fireplace insert, yes, but these 2 are the real biggies that we're going to focus on. And the exciting thing, I have to say, one of the reasons why I'm so obsessed about this now is because, a year and a half ago when I was doing the research on this stuff, and I didn't even know what a heat pump was. The truth is, these things have been around for decades and they're insanely efficient. They'll save you money. They'll give you all sorts of other benefits. They're way, way, way more efficient than natural gas. And you can use the same technology, heat pumps, for furnaces, air conditioning, and for heating your water. It sounds like the space age thing. The truth is they've been in our lives forever. Anyone who has a refrigerator has a heat pump in your home right now. Basically what this technology does is it moves energy from one place to another. So your refrigerator, if you put your hand behind the back, you'll feel how it's warm back there. That's because it's moving heat from inside your refrigerator to your kitchen. Your kitchen gets slightly warmer. Inside the refrigerator, it gets cooler. So it's not making heat or making cool, which is currently not possible, but it moves heat from one place to another, and that's why they're so efficient. A great way of demonstrating this efficiency is to compare water heaters. Here in Oregon, if you spend $10 on natural gas, you're going to get about 5 hot showers for that. Maybe 7 if you have the most expensive, up-to-date gas water heater, which most people don't have because they cost like $3,000. But typically 5. For a good heat pump water heater, not even the very best, you're going to get 10 for $10 worth of electricity. So twice the amount of benefit basically for the same money, which is why this technology is going to be the future. I mean, I think if we flash forward 20 years, the only kind of water heaters are going to exist are heat pump water heaters. But the urgency we have to make this transition now is something why you as a homeowner can make a big difference in terms of kind of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. And it's going to save you money. This is why that's a fact. Now, it's important to note that they can be more expensive upfront to install. And we're going to go into all this when we'll dive into water heaters later. but you will more than make up for the money in the long term through the operating cost savings. The same is true with furnaces. It's not quite as dramatic, but for most people, the comparison that's relevant is this one. If you've got a furnace that's more than about 5 years old, it's typically in this rate, or it might be even more because their efficiency degrades over time. If you've got electric or oil furnace, a heat pump's going to blow those away in terms of cost per BTU. The very best modern gas furnaces are quite good in terms of their cost. But I think the big takeaway from this is, from a cost standpoint, they're at least neutral, if not better. And the best ductless heat pumps are absolutely the cheapest way to get heat in your home. Again, we'll talk about all this in more detail when we get into it, the details on furnaces. But the other advantage that heat pumps have is they can work both directions. So they give you air conditioning as well. So that's becoming more and more of an issue, even here in the cool Northwest, where summers are getting hotter, forest fires, et cetera, don't make you not want to open your windows at night. Having air conditioning essentially for free when you buy a heat pump furnace is a pretty attractive thing. They're definitely more comfortable because they're moving air more constantly, which means that the temperature in your home stays the same. That you don't get these big spikes from when the furnace goes on and then turns off and gets cooler and then goes up and down. And because of that continuous air movement, you get cleaner air, which is actually noticeable. And so people are quite happy with the way these heat pumps perform in terms of the way they feel. And then, of course, because you did step number one and signed up for clean energy, it's creating zero emissions, which is fantastic. There's tons of other devices in our homes that burn fossil fuels, and there's an electric equivalent for every one of them. And believe me, I've done this myself. I can vouch for it. They're better. I think induction stoves versus gas stoves, even electric barbecue versus gas barbecue. I'll talk to you about that. We're going to do a session on that later. But just suffice it to know that any device you have in your home right now that burns natural gas or gasoline or propane, you can replace that with an electric option. And you'll be happy you did. All right, transportation. I think a lot of us know that transportation is a problem. A lot of us know that cars create emissions. There's a lot of discussion as well about airfare and air traffic. And there's a lot of shaming that happens in some ways about air travel, and I get it. We should all be thinking about reducing air travel. I think the pandemic is showing us that we don't have to fly around as much maybe as we thought. But the truth is that if you want to get from here to New York City or here to Tokyo or something, there's no better way. There's no alternative other than to fly. So if you have to fly, I don't want to talk you out of going there if you need to visit your grandmother or something. But the truth is, airfare is a relatively small part of our transportation emissions. The big one is the car in your driveway, by far the biggest one. 60% comes from cars we drive. Another 23% comes from the trucks that are on the road. The good news, the bad news is we don't really have good solutions for these guys over here. It's being worked on. Hydrogen's appealing, and it might come online. There are some electrification options in this zone, but this is going to be tough. There is good technology here today to solve these two problems. And you're going to be seeing trucks on the road in the next year. That's going to happen fast. And for the reasons we'll describe later, it's not because the truckers are really trying to kind of save the planet. It's because it's cheaper. And the same is true for automobiles. All right. The reason why these guys are so bad is because 1 year of driving around creates about almost 6 tons of carbon emissions, which, by the way, is about the same amount that it took to make the thing. And then it's going to be on the road for 12 or 15 years. So that's at 75 tons over the lifespan of it, which is 10x what the emissions were to make the thing in the first place, which is a reason why you should not worry about squeezing every last ounce out of any of these things that you have, because that calculation is true for pretty much everything that burns fossil fuels. So don't worry about squeezing every last minute of life out of your fossil fuels things. Get rid of them as soon as you can, because using them is way worse than making them. So retire them. But 5.8 tons a year. If you have an electric car, you charge it at home, which is what people do. 95% of the charging happens in your garage or, plugged into your electric supply. And because you've done step number one, all your mileage is zero emissions, which is pretty amazing. The great news is that battery prices are getting lower. It's on the same curve that we saw with solar, a tenth of what it was 10 years ago, and it's projected to get under $100 per kilowatt hour for batteries in the next year or so. So that means the cars are getting cheaper, and they're going to continue to get cheaper as they scale up. The charging options are dramatically increasing. I mean, it was pretty tricky to charge your car a few years ago if you're driving around. Now they're everywhere, and it's happening so fast. Volkswagen is spending literally billions of dollars on charging infrastructure in this country that's going to rival the Tesla structure and make it really easy to go long distance, but it's already possible. The amount of cars that we have to choose from are getting better. This is the lineup that's coming from Volkswagen in the next year. So the choices are getting better. And the prices are surprisingly affordable today. I mean, there's this perception that EVs are more expensive, and yes, there's some truth to that. But if you really dive into the numbers, you'll see that it's not true. They're actually cheaper, even today. And the best way to describe this is to look at a car where there's a gas and an electric version of the same car. And I like this Kia Niro example because it's a great car. My brother's got one. You can do gas or electric. You can see the initial price is more, but by the time you get the federal and Oregon credits, it's getting closer. And when you look at the 5-year cost because of fuel costs and maintenance, and number comes from the AAA. I don't know what they're talking about with $3,700 for maintenance for an electric car for 5 years. I mean, that's a lot of windshield wiper fluid, if you ask me, because windshield wiper fluid, and tires. That is the maintenance cost for an EV for the most part. There's no engine tune-ups, filter replacements, none of that. So, but the 5-year view, even with these conservative numbers from AAA, it's cheaper to own the the electric car than the gas car. The reason that the trucking companies are so excited about this is this comparison here. Another model where there's 2 versions is the Volkswagen Golf. Volkswagen Golf, the gas one, gets pretty good mileage. For $10 of gas, you're going to get 100 miles of travel. The electric version of that, for $10 of electricity, you're going to get 300 miles of transportation. So this is why the trucking industry is so interested in this and why it's going to happen fast in that sector, because fuel is the most expensive part of their operational cost by far. And then, the other thing, the qualitative things, like talk to anybody who owns an EV, they'll tell you they're never going to go back to a gas car. They're way more fun to drive. They're faster acceleration, all these stuff. Even my wife, who isn't a big car enthusiast, is crazy about how fast our cars accelerate and how fun they are to drive. And yeah, who wants to go to gas station? I mean, raise your hand if you love gas stations. I don't think many people out there are raising their hands. You can just eliminate that from your life. So a lot of other good reasons to do this. All right, I've thrown a lot of information at you and we're running short of time here, but if you take nothing else away from this, remember these 4 largest sources of emissions in your life. Yes, it's important to think about the choices we make for the products we buy, the food we eat, how much we travel, etc. Energy efficiency, super important. But these 4 decisions that you make, the electricity you purchase, the car you drive, the furnace, source of energy for your furnace and your water heater, those blow any other decision you can make about carbon emissions away by factors of 10. And so these big ones, they're not fun to do. Nobody wants to buy a new water heater. But when it's time to do that, make sure you're thinking about heat pumps, same with furnaces, and do it sooner than you might otherwise want to if you can, if you're able to, because that's how you're going to avoid a lot of carbon. All right, so just summary. These are the 3 steps. Clean up your electric supply. I would ask you to go check where you are on your electric plan right as soon as you hang up here. Electrify your home, electrify your ride. You're going to be avoiding tons of carbon emissions. You're going to enjoy a more comfortable life and a lot of performance benefits. You will save money on operating costs, absolutely. And importantly, this is a really big one. What you're doing is you're helping to accelerate the transition to these clean energy solutions, which are essential. Otherwise, it's really bleak for our offspring in terms of what the world's going to look like to live in. So the faster we do these things, the better. If you want to hear about what this can look like on a more national scale, I love this book from my friend Saul Griffith. He just launched this a few days ago. It's kind of a handbook for how to do this on a large scale. It's kind of equivalent to thinking about, you know, the way we mobilize for World War II. It's that kind of thinking. It's a really good read if you'd like to see what that looks like on a more of a national scale. And then again, if you have any questions about this, we have tons of information on our website, electrifynow.net. I want to give a shout out to the Heat Pump Store and Green Savers, two of our partner orgs, and there's more of them listed, contractors that we know do good service. We'll give you actually a discount if you mentioned that you got there from Electrify Now, because we provide them with some business. We have no financial connection to these groups, but we're trying to make it easier for people like you to take these steps. So there's lots of resources like this on our website as well. These two just happen to have helped promote us with this webinar series, so I wanted to give them a little shout out. All right, that's it for me. Joe, how are we doing?
Well, we're right on the top of the hour, but like any good webinar, we've gone over time, and that's awesome. I think we could do maybe a question or two, and then if we haven't we've responded to a lot in the chat, and if people have to jump off, that's fine too. We'll go another 5 minutes if that works. One quick one I just wanted to read about, do heat pump water furnaces, water heaters provide the same efficiency regardless of local climate, for example, colder, drier climates? Can either of you guys speak to that?
I can definitely speak to that, Joe. I mean, here in Oregon, heat pumps are a no-brainer. In places like Bend, where it gets quite a bit colder, they're actually very popular because natural gas is not as available in some of those places. Electric heat pumps are being used in Vermont, in Alaska, in Finland. They've been used for years. So this technology, there's different versions. If you're really far north in a really cold country, you need a slightly different version of it. But for essentially the continental United States, there's heat pump solutions available that are going to work in your climate. So the short answer is yes, it'll work.
Okay, great, perfect. And then somebody mentioned also hydrogen as a bridge fuel. Can either of you comment on where we are with hydrogen and how it plays into electrification?
Karina, are you up on hydrogen?
I can maybe take a little pass on that. I put hydrogen is in my category of interesting things that I'm watching. I myself, and I think most in kind of in the field, don't think that it's quite there yet. It's sort of a little bit like renewable natural gas, and that it's an interesting concept and it has potential to be something even more interesting. I don't know that I would say that it's really a solution yet. I think at this point, you know, the things that we're looking at is the mature technologies, because that's one I would say that still is in emerging. The mature technologies of wind, solar, storage, that kind of stuff, those can be deployed at scale right now very effectively, very cheaply. And so that's where we're seeing the short term in. Yeah, hydrogen is, we'll see where it goes. All the different colors of hydrogen, blue, green, I heard heliotrope recently, turquoise, there's all sorts of different flavors of hydrogen right now that are looking at, so.
Awesome. Cool. Okay, great. Well then, and why don't, would each of you leave us with your top electrification tip for folks? We presented some options. What should folks do immediately? They have to go right after this webinar.
Well, I guess I'll say I can tell you what my family's doing is we're putting together our plan and our budget and figuring out how we're going to get our homes switched over. I mean, we do, like I said, we're doing the demand response program already. We do already subscribe to the green energy option with PGE, but like I showed, our emissions impact is very clear. So we're putting together our plan to get everything switched over.
I love that. I love that idea of a plan, because a lot of these things are not things you're not just going to run out and do them tomorrow, because, you know, some of them, but over the next 5 years, if you're thinking that kind of timeline, it's possible to do these sorts of things. So I love that idea of a plan. The tip that I would add is hot water heaters, because right now, and there's a lot of information about this online on our website, but there are insane deals being offered for heat pump water heaters. It's one of the biggest sources of emissions in your life, and it's relatively cost effective. I mean, you're talking about, you know, hundreds to maybe a little over $1,000 to switch, and you're going to get immediate benefits in terms of reducing your electric bills or your gas bills, and a big impact. And the timing is good because there's a lot of incentives which are available today that are worth looking at. So water heaters, that would be my tip.
Fantastic. Great. Well, thank you to you all for joining us for our first in this webinar series. Join us on September 23rd for our upcoming webinar, Induction Cooking. The link is far down in the chat, and you'll be getting plenty of emails from us. Thanks to our panelists so much, Brian Stewart and Karina Hirschberg, for being with us today. And look forward to seeing you all in the future. Have a great rest of your Thursday.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being here. We are so excited to have you. And with that, I want to pass it over to my colleague, Cora. Take it away.
Hi, I just want to echo Logan's thanks. We're really excited about this event. Thank you for being here. My name is Cora Weisbord. I'm one of the facilitators of the Massachusetts Building Electrification Accelerator and also a volunteer with Mothers Out Front. So we have amazing speakers today and a lot to learn in an hour. First, we're going to hear from Sarah Ross, a co-founder of Undaunted K-12, on making the case for all electric schools and leveraging new federal and local incentives supporting school electrification. Next, Pip Lewis, a principal with HMFH Architects, will discuss designing Boston's new Josiah Quincy Upper School. Talia Fox, the sustainability manager with the town of Arlington, will tell us about Arlington's air quality and electrification master plan. And finally, we'll share some resources and actions before moving into our Q&A. Next slide, please. So to get us started, we're going to hear from Sarah Ross. Sarah is a co-founder of Undaunted K-12. Undaunted K-12 is a nonprofit focused on supporting America's public schools to make an equitable transition to zero carbon while preparing youth to build sustainable futures in a rapidly changing climate. Sarah is an experienced clean energy executive. Prior to Undaunted, Sarah founded SunGage Financial, a residential solar finance company that makes rooftop solar available to more homeowners. Sarah lives in an all-electric net zero retrofit in Amherst and loves that her teenager is learning to drive an electric vehicle. Sarah, thank you for joining us and for kicking us off today. I will let you take it from here.
There we go. Thanks for unmuting me. So nice to be with you all today. Logan, you can move on to the next slide. As Cora mentioned, we are part of a nonprofit, Undaunted K-12, that's focused on helping states really connect the dots between their climate aspirations, their climate ambition, and the role that they play in school infrastructure. This is a very exciting moment for school infrastructure, so we're excited to talk to you all about how we can leverage that new funding in our schools in Massachusetts. Logan, you can move on to the next slide and then keep going from there. So if we want to electrify our schools, I'm going to make the case that we need to focus on HVAC systems. Why is that? Why do we need to focus on HVAC systems? So it turns out HVAC systems are actually the largest user of energy in our school buildings. Over on the left, you're seeing heating, cooling, and ventilation, the three components that really make up an HVAC system, taking up well over half of the energy that a school uses. So they are kind of the big user of energy. Then on the right, you see, of that heating energy usage, the vast majority of our heating systems in Massachusetts rely on fossil fuels, gas, oil, a little bit of dual fuel in there. In fact, this is as of the last inventory in 2016. We should have a newer one, but this is the best we have right now. Almost 98% of our HVAC systems in the state, in schools, burn fossil fuels. So big energy users, highly reliant on fossil fuels. You can go to the next slide. So next, I'm going to make the statement, the contention that switching to heat pumps is the single most impactful action we can actually take in our school buildings to contend with climate change. Why is that the case? So let's step back and just make sure everyone knows what a heat pump is. Heat pumps are a magical piece of mechanical systems that actually do a smart thing and move heat rather than burning fossil fuels to make heat. This eliminates all the on-site combustion that would normally be associated with an HVAC system. This improves indoor and outdoor air quality. Heat pumps are also highly efficient, whereas a brand new top-of-the-line gas boiler is only going to get to 98% efficient. heat pumps can get, and particularly ground source heat pumps, can get to from 300 to 600% efficient. That means for every 1 unit of energy we're putting in to run this piece of mechanical systems, we're getting 3 to 6 units of heat out of that. And again, that magic happens because we're moving heat rather than burning things to make heat. The last thing to know about heat pump is that it offers both heating and cooling. This is really important for our school buildings. Can move on to the next slide. So part of the reason why we need to focus on HVAC systems is because they're not up to the job right now in our schools. You know, we've certainly experienced through COVID the challenges of out-of-date HVAC systems. But as we look forward, what schools are contending with more and more is extreme heat, and the fact that our schools in the Northeast were not built to contend with these extreme temperatures. There's an estimate that nationally, we're going to have to spend $40 billion just to keep up with the demand for cooling in our schools. And teachers, rightly, are now actually starting to bargain on things like the temperature in their classrooms. You're seeing a post here from the Boston Teachers Union showing it, 88 degrees in the classroom. This has real impacts on students' ability to learn and their health. Next slide. The other reason that heat pumps are really an important piece is that they can help us substantially reduce our contribution to building emissions. So on the left, you're seeing a chart that was in the decarbonization roadmap showing the square footage of schools. Unfortunately, Logan, you can go to the next slide. They made a little boo-boo in the square footage there. Schools are actually a top 5 building type when we look at all our square footage of commercial buildings that we need to decarbonize by 2050. And they're top of the line in terms of our public building types. So they are a really important sector in which to do this work. Next slide. So now is really the moment to take action. Why is that? You've already gotten kind of the spoiler alert there, right? These new federal funds that are now available for schools. So on the left-hand side, Inflation Reduction Act provides a new, basically 30 to 50% off coupon, you can think of it as, for, in particular, the most efficient of the heat pumps, the ground source heat pump. This funding, like many parts of the investment tax credit in the Inflation Reduction Act, is available for 10 years. So schools have a really long runway to think about how to do their long-term facilities planning to be able to move in this direction. It's non-competitive. There's no application in the sense that it needs to get, you need to kind of justify your expense. This is about documenting the work that you've done. And it's paid for the first time as a cash payment to non-taxable entities like schools. There is no funding cap on this opportunity, so they're not going to kind of run out of money. The typical value for this incentive will be somewhere between $2 to $6 million, just to give you some sense of how much this is really going to be worth to schools as they seek to move in this direction. Now, schools in Massachusetts can pair that with a newly enriched, really valuable incentive from MassSave. They now are offering $4,500 per ton. This is like based on the size, basically, of the HVAC system for schools, both in new construction and, importantly, in retrofits. Similarly, this is non-competitive. So the typical value of this incentive will be between $500K and $2 million for a school. Next slide. So to wrap this all together in a project that I know well, that's going on here in Massachusetts right now, we have some price points for a new school where we're hoping to combine a ground source heat pump, a solar array that'll provide the clean energy for this heat pump. And right now, the price points for those two really important, really valuable pieces of technology is $13.7 million. Just to give you a sense of, again, how these incentives will reduce that upfront cost, that MassSave incentive is going to take $1.6 million off the sticker price. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to take somewhere between 30 and 50% off the sticker price, turning the new cost upfront to this district of somewhere between 5.2 million and 8 million. That is just a whirlwind change from where things were before the Inflation Reduction Act was passed, before MassSave made these incentives even more valuable. So in talking with engineers across the country, post-Inflation Reduction Act, what I'm hearing is that as they are bidding out new work, they're finding that ground source heat pumps, the thing that used to be the most expensive, is now coming in as the least cost option for many of their clients. So this is just a huge change, and something that Massachusetts schools can all organize to take advantage of, in the coming years. Next slide. Really, there are six, just to highlight, there are 6 benefits for, and we've touched on some of them, of why this is so valuable, moving from a pre-IRA world where the vast majority of our schools are dependent on gas and oil, adapting these new cooling needs, enhancing efficiency, improving air quality. There's also health and safety concerns in getting this combustible fuel out of our schools. When paired with solar and energy storage, as they're going to do in Acton Boxborough, we can build the resilience of our school buildings. And of course, by removing the combustion of these fossil fuels, we are helping schools participate and be part of mitigating impacts on climate change and achieving our Massachusetts goals of achieving net zero. Next slide. Thank you so much. You'll hear from me again later on in the presentation.
Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Are you introducing me or?
Yes, I'm trying to get the tech. All right. We can all see each other again. Sarah, thank you so much for your presentation, for sharing these game-changing new incentives, particularly, and for setting the stage for us. So next, we will hear from Pip Lewis with a Boston school case study. Pip is a principal at HMFH Architects and AIA and LEED AP certified. HMFH Architects is a Cambridge-based woman-owned architecture firm specializing in the design of innovative, sustainable learning environments. Pip has over 40 years of experience in the architecture, engineering, and construction industry, and has led the design of numerous successful school projects across Massachusetts. Most recently, he has been the project director for the new all-electric, carbon-neutral Josiah Quincy Upper School in Boston's Chinatown neighborhood. Pip, thank you so much for being here. I will let you take it from here and tell us all about the Quincy Upper School.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. And you can go on to the next slide. So thank you for having me here to talk about this, the Josiah Quincy Upper School, which I hopefully will offer some lessons in electrifying schools while providing a high quality indoor environment for the students. The Josiah Quincy Upper School is unusual because it's very urban. It's being constructed in Boston's extremely dense Chinatown area. And next, it's a full service middle high school for 650 students, but it's being built on less than an acre of land. So it's a very rare, very vertical school and has none of the usual outdoor play space that you might usually expect to find in a school. Next. A Tufts University study recently found that the area that's being built in has the most polluted air in Massachusetts due to being located directly adjacent to the Mass Pike and so close to the massive I-93 interchange and also railroad tracks. Next. It also was being designed when the then Mayor Walsh issued a zero carbon executive order asking that new municipal buildings be built to be electrically heated and cooled. So that became our goal for the project. And as you see here, we also created a very large outdoor educational space on the roof area of the Quincy Upper School, where students will find activities such as outdoor classrooms, student gardens, gathering spaces, giving students an opportunity to get some fresh air way up high, where the Tufts study says the air will actually be cleaner than it is at grade. Next. The study also recommended that buildings might mitigate poor air quality by following a few steps, and we have incorporated them into the design of the building. First of all of the school's fresh air is drawn from up as high as possible and facing away from the pollutant source, which in this case is the turnpike. The classroom air, for instance, will come from rooftop units located 130 feet above the street. We also upgraded the MERV 13 and 14, MERV 13 filters to MERV 14 filters in order to decrease the amount of particulates that's in the air that people will breathe inside the school. And then one final step that we took was to use the displacement ventilation system within the rooms of the school, but I'll get to explaining that in a moment. Next, you can go to the next slide. First, I wanted to look at how we, some of the process of choosing the system using a life cycle cost analysis and other methods. And this was actually a complex process, which is full of choices, and we found also full of some compromises, which you'll hear about. The first cluster of information there goes to predicting the energy that a building will consume, resulting in a simulation for that building or an energy model. The second cluster is establishing what the costs of that system will be, including first the first construction costs, maintenance costs over time, and the useful equipment life replacement costs, all resulting in a life cycle analysis, life cycle cost analysis. Go to the next slide. Yeah. And we looked at several options that all really focus on all electric choices. And the life cycle cost analysis really led us to looking at the top two options there, 1 and 2, which are actually both very similar displacement ventilation options, and are kind of illustrated, if you can see in the upper, that little model of a room there on the upper portion of the slide. The only difference between the two systems is, I'll get to later on, it involves boilers. But they both use water source heat pumps located on the roof to condition the air very effectively, and radiant panels within the rooms to temper the spaces. You can go to the next slide. And we also took a great effort to develop a very tight building, very efficient building with a low EUI. EUI is simply a measure that can be used to estimate the amount of energy per square foot per year that a building will use. We came at Quincy Upper, we're at 24. That compares favorably with the other schools that we show in green there that we have done. And it's interesting to see that the average, the national average for K-12 schools is 75, which is 3 times as much energy being expended per square foot than we're expecting the new Quincy Upper School to use. Next. And now to sort of explain displacement ventilation and contrast it with the traditional mixed air method that we're all used to seeing. In mixed air systems, warm or chilled air, depending on the season, is projected into the room at a relatively high speed to mix with other air to reach the desired temperature. In displacement, however, large quantities of air are allowed to flow out low across the room at a slow speed, displacing the existing warm air there. The occupants themselves in the room heat the air slowly, and it will rise vertically to the ceiling where it's exhausted. This vertical motion limits the spread of dust and allergens around the room, and in addition to providing a very good and very quiet indoor air quality environment. But next slide. We did run into some stumbling blocks, or a stumbling block. the water source heat pumps that we were trying to use could not extract enough heat on the coldest winter days to sufficiently heat the school. And so we needed to supplement with supplemental boilers, which are located on the top of the building, that long gray box on the right-hand side. And these either needed to be powered by electricity or gas-fired. Next. So our life cycle cost analysis showed us, unfortunately, that the power for these electric boilers, which is system 1 in the chart there, would cost significantly more over a 20-year period than the gas-fired boilers, which is system 1A. And across the bottom of the page there, you see the savings. Those numbers are the savings that are predicted over a 20-year period compared to a baseline. And that really doesn't show good results for an all electric system. But go to the next slide, please. Thank you. There are ways of mitigating this cost difference. We at Quincy Upper plan to use a photovoltaic array to offset the costs of the electricity. We ran into some hurdles there, but we'll talk about it in just a bit. But one might also use air source heat pumps on the roof that would eliminate, we understand entirely, the need for the supplemental boilers. However, these are very large and would take up more space than we wanted to use, which we wanted to prioritize for that rooftop educational space that you saw. You could also use a geothermal system or ground source heat pump system that Sarah talked about. And that would also eliminate the need for these supplemental boilers. But in Quincy Upper's case, we had such a tight urban site that we really didn't have any open land to use for the drilling of the well fields. Next. And as I said, our intention at Quincy Upper was to use a photovoltaic system. But even this system needed to be very small because our rooftop is very small. And it had to stay off of the area that was going to be occupied by students. And so it had to be built on structure over the mechanical units that are on the roof. So it was also expensive to provide that structure. And as we did an analysis of the energy that the system would generate versus the cost of the system over time, we were finding a savings, but the savings wasn't enough to completely mitigate the high cost of electrical for the boilers. And so eventually, as we wrestled with the budget, we had to value engineer out that system. Now, I really don't think that most school projects will have the same problems finding the perfect system as the Quincy Upper School did, because you'll have plenty of rooftop area, plenty of site area, and you'll find one or more practical and very economical ways of providing an all electric facility. Happily, Quincy Upper chose to adhere to the city's commitment to a zero carbon all electric facility and stayed with the electric boilers despite our electric utility costs. Next. And so the construction of Boston's new all electric school is already towering over the Mass Pike as we speak, and opening for classes in 2024, which, as you can see, this future occupant certainly appears to find the concept of this electrifying. Thank you.
Pip, thank you for sharing that gorgeous school with us. Next, we're going to hear from Talia Fox on Arlington's Air Quality and Electrification Master Plan. Talia is the Sustainability Manager for the town of Arlington. In this role, she is leading implementation of the town's Net Zero Action Plan, Green Communities Program, Arlington Community Electricity Program, and the Electrify Arlington campaign, among other projects targeting greenhouse gas reduction. Talia has expertise in community-driven sustainability and resilience planning, facilitation, and equitable community engagement, and has led several climate action planning processes in the greater Boston region. Talia holds a master's in city planning from MIT. Talia, thank you for being with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Cora. All right, so I'm Talia. I'm the Sustainability Manager for the town of Arlington, and I'm excited to be sharing a little bit about, at a high level, our air quality and electrification master plan for the town. You can go to the next slide, please. And the next slide. I'll just mention that I was not here for the beginning part of this process, as I only came on board earlier in the year. So like many other municipalities, Arlington has a net zero action plan with a goal of net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We have priority areas in that plan that focus on net zero buildings, zero emissions mobility, and clean energy. And one specific priority action we have in there focuses on town buildings, specifically reducing energy use from those buildings, maximizing renewable energy technologies, and making new buildings, and specifically major renovations fossil fuel free. You can go to the next slide. So like other municipalities, also municipal buildings are not a huge portion of our total community-wide emissions. Nevertheless, it is important that as a municipality, we're focusing on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our buildings because we have a degree of control over those buildings, unlike other buildings in town. And it's important to be leading by example in this space right now. Next slide, please. So the goal of our master planning effort here was to understand the potential to reduce energy use and fossil fuel use in existing buildings. So we're looking here in, sort of in an innovative way, I think, at retrofits versus new construction. And we wanted to improve air quality, specifically in our schools. And we focused on schools because they represent about 3/4 of the total square footage that the town owns, and 66%, nearly 2/3 of our building energy use in town, of the municipal building energy use. Next slide, please. And we decided to focus on 6 out of our 11 total schools in town here. And that was largely due to the age of the school. The 5 schools that we did not choose, which are not listed here, are either relatively new or being rebuilt. So Arlington High School is actually a new all-electric building that is underway right now. And so the other schools that we focused on are listed here. Next slide. We had some high-level goals for this study. So here are some of the deliverables that are listed in our RFP, which I know we'll be sharing after this event. But first, we wanted to understand what our baseline was, what existing HVAC equipment and systems did we have in place, electrical service to the building, domestic hot water, and the like. And we wanted to identify alternatives. How could we convert our fossil fuel-based heating systems to all electric? We wanted to make sure we could maintain healthy facilities and acceptable, if not superior, indoor air quality, and then make sure that our classrooms and educational spaces were comfortable for learning and teaching. Other deliverables for our RFP included understanding what solar capacity might be needed to offset energy use on site. So we looked at, or our consultant is looking at, rooftop solar photovoltaics and solar hot water, as well as feasibility of battery storage. And then finally, it's important for us to understand the timeline for these projects, for these 6 schools and their renovations, and what they're going to cost. So that's a big part of this report. A big focus, as I mentioned, was air quality. It's in the title of the master plan. Like in many places, there is an increased concern around air quality following the pandemic. Arlington invested in a lot of filtration equipment for our schools. And we know here, I think if anybody who's here knows that electrification supports indoor air quality, we want to be reducing on-site combustion and improving ventilation to support that comfort and better learning and working environment. So the 2 viable electrification options that we looked at, which I'll talk about later, have dedicated ventilation air systems to deliver filtered fresh air to all spaces. Here's a high-level timeline of our project. Our net zero action plan was adopted, just for reference, in early 2021. We released an RFP for this project in the summer of 2021, and then contracted with a consultant, CMTA, in the fall of 2021. And they got started late in 2021 into early 2022 with that initial baseline assessment of the building systems, continuing with an alternatives analysis for the different electrification options. And we are in phase 3 right now, so I will not be able to share specifics from our budget, but that is underway. So our consultants looked at 4 alternatives for our HVAC systems in the 6 schools. I will say 2 of these are largely for reference. The first one here is an in-kind replacement where we're basically assuming that we're going to replace all of the existing equipment with new equipment when it breaks. So that's keeping natural gas in a lot of cases, and also in other cases not even including AC, because several of our buildings, being old buildings, do not have AC. The second option here is, I would say, like a standard but inefficient electrification option. So it achieves the goal of electrification, but doesn't do it in the most efficient way possible. It's an interesting comparison point simply because it does assume a certain degree of swap out of existing systems, but it's extremely inefficient, as we know, inefficient as we know electric resistance is, but an interesting comparison point. The 2 more important options here are the variable refrigerant flow, which is an air source heat pump system, and then the ground source heat pump system that we looked at for all 6 schools. And those are the 2 more viable electrification options. You can see here on the right, as part of this report, we have proposed geothermal well field designs for all of the schools. So this is one for the Addison Middle School, conveniently has some fields adjacent to the building where we can be drilling. And all of the proposed designs for HVAC use existing ductwork where possible to try to reduce costs. Some additional components, some of these things Pip had mentioned. So we looked at a few different things in terms of life cycle cost analysis. It included upfront costs, but also operational costs, maintenance, replacement costs, and solar PV costs to really take into account what it's going to mean to replace these over the lifetime of the systems. We have some phasing recommendations that relate to in what order and how long is it going to take to electrify these buildings. And those are based on the building age, the greenhouse gas footprint of the different buildings, and the costs. Just considerations for the town to keep in mind as we're thinking about, how we're going to sequence this. And then all of them have solar designs to utilize available rooftop space and an additional canopy as needed for net zero energy on site. I think we've talked a lot about these incentives already. So the thing I'll mention here is that the IRA and direct pay option for ground source heat pumps is a real game changer for these projects. For all of the schools, the incentives make it such that the ground source heat pumps cost less than the VRF system. And that's exciting because the ground source heat pump systems are more efficient operationally speaking. So that's huge. Assuming we can make those ground source systems work, it will sort of depend on the configuration. That will be big here. So at a high level, some takeaways here. Every system has its pros and cons, and I think the town's going to have to really think about some of these things, ranging from aesthetics to operational efficiency. I think every site is going to have its unique configuration and considerations there. My biggest takeaway from this whole process has just been the amount of time it's going to take. When we're looking at the time frame that the consultant provided for sequencing just 6 of our school buildings, we're looking out to 2035, I'd say, on a, with a conservative estimate. I think that's ambitious. And that's just 6 of our buildings, right? So if we're thinking about a 2050 timeframe for all of this, we really need to start planning ahead, not just in Arlington, but I'd say all across the state. And then it was interesting that we did this as a 6-school plan because of the fact that we know technology is changing, costs are shifting. And so by the time we get to that 6th school, we'll see what everything looks like. And so we're thinking going forward that maybe it makes more sense to do this on a school by school basis so that the planning is a little closer to when we might actually implement. Here's some lessons learned on the procurement side from my predecessor who initiated this process. I think it is sort of cutting edge to be looking at retrofitting existing buildings for all electric, and finding firms with experience doing that was a little tricky. So we got fewer proposals than we thought, and not all met the minimum qualifications. And then we had some scoping challenges where we basically had to reduce the scope to fit our budget. So just a friendly reminder to state your budgets up front in your RFPs. Finally, we're looking at next steps here in Arlington. So just doing some internal reviews of a draft report, and then thinking about next steps for us for these buildings. What's our time frame and what's the feasibility of actually implementing a lot of these recommendations? I'll be keeping an eye on federal and state grants and putting in capital requests for similar studies of the rest of the buildings in our portfolio. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
So Talia, thank you so much for sharing your work in Arlington and for leading this critical planning process to retrofit your existing schools. Now, Sarah is going to close out today's event by sharing some resources and action steps before we move on to our Q&A. We have a lot of great questions in the chat, and we're going to try and get to as many as we can.
Great, thank you. Logan, you can move on to the next slide. So a few resources and some of the questions in the chat will hopefully be answered by this paper, but I won't make you wait for some of them. So we have a new paper coming out early next year that is really aiming to help school leaders, so not a technical audience, but people like superintendents, school committee members, see the HVAC choices and see how they are connected to the student health and learning that they hold paramount. This is not going to get into technical details. This is really high-level strategic thinking about these HVAC choices, and does, I will say, make the case for moving to the all-electric high-performance systems that both Pip and Talia talked about today. We'll put a link in the chat to sign up for that report, but we're very excited about this filling a gap in what we see available to school leaders right now on a topic that can get really confusing and really technical very fast in an unhelpful way. So look forward to that. The next thing I'll turn you to is, or offer to you, is the section of our website that we call our K-12 Climate Solutions Center. It has a bunch of resources from all around the country, examples of schools, doing various parts of this work, much bigger than HVAC, but this whole constellation of exciting climate action. We have Talia's RFP up there. We've up there posted for folks because that's a great artifact. A plan from Salt Lake City that was really led by students, other resolutions from schools across the country that are passing resolutions, for example, in Portland to get fossil fuels out of their existing buildings. So a lot of great resources here, and those will continue to grow as more of that material becomes available. Next. And then, lastly, as a point of kind of competitive, get our competitive juices flowing, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that just a few days ago, late October, New York City really put themselves in a leadership position when it comes to retrofitting existing buildings and removing fossil fuels. The mayor announced a $4 billion plan to electrify 800 schools in New York City. This is will be the single most impactful thing that the city will do to meet its own compliance with its goals to reduce building emissions. So reminding me, and I should remind all of us, that schools are vital to achieving our climate goals. And importantly, they're prioritizing doing this retrofit work in the schools that right now are burning the dirtiest of fuels, the number 4 heating oil, and in the communities that are most burdened by air pollution. The type of communities that Pip was talking about, sitting right next to a highway. So for me, and by the way, they've connected it to the learning agenda and thinking about how this can help develop a green workforce in New York State. So to me, this is really a model, and I certainly hope that it gets our competitive juices flowing with new leadership here in the state, and that we move in this direction of really focusing on retrofits serving the most vulnerable. Next slide. All right, so what can you do today when you leave this event? We have prepared a quick little one-pager that will help you engage leaders in your district around this new opportunity to retrofit, make a plan to retrofit and get fossil fuels out of our schools and switch to this new technology. And again, it's really focused on heat pumps, given the new incentives from Mass Save and in the case of ground source heat pumps, the Inflation Reduction Act. This is available on our website for you to download. We've even given you a little template email that you can make your own as you engage your district leaders. So wanted to offer that up. And I think now, question time.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much for those wonderful presentations. So helpful and so much great content in there. I see that there have been questions coming in from the chat. So I think what I'll do, I think we'll have time maybe to get to 3 or 4 questions. So I've been trying to pay attention to the ones that that might be most suited for everyone. And I'm going to start with a question that was submitted by Martha from Melrose, asking about what section of the IRS code under IRA offers the heat pump incentive, and have the regulations been promulgated yet, or will they be introduced through a different mechanism?
I'm happy to take that one. Cora, I don't know if you want to drop what I wrote there into the chat, but I'll just really say, so it's the investment tax credit, which has been around for a while. It's the same vehicle that we've used to grow our solar industry to great heights in this country. What they did with the Inflation Reduction Act was they expanded the technologies that it is available for. So there's geothermal is among those new technologies. And they've combined it, importantly, with a new provision called direct pay, which makes this tax credit right now available as a cash payment to non-taxable entities like schools. So you really have to see these two things and put them together. And I apologize, I should put the section in there that's the direct pay section, because that's a whole different section. So you got to kind of be expert at reading this stuff and see how these two pieces fit together. But this is an existing playbook that's basically been improved on, V2.0, I guess you could say. And sorry, excellent. And the timing on the promulgation. So what's available right now is the 30%. As you noted in my presentation, it was 30 to 50%. So there's an additional 10% if you use American-made parts, particularly things like steel. I think supply chains will still determine whether that is possible and accessible in the short term. I was talking to some solar installers yesterday, and they said, for ground mounts, that's going to be really easy to meet the test for domestic content there. For roof mounts, it's going to be a little harder because we don't have American-made panels. We do have American-made racking. So there's an additional 10% that'll come available January 1. So this is projects put into service after January 1. And then another 10% will be available for projects that are located in what's called an energy community. This is a new concept that was introduced by the Inflation Reduction Act. And we have yet to see formal US government, maps that designate, you are an energy community, you are an energy community. There are maps out there of folks already opining, kind of guessing and reading the tea leaves, but those pieces will become available. And we expect guidance out from the IRS January, February of 2023. I know there are RFIs out that folks are responding to help guide the development of those regulations, and we should see those early in the new year.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. And Pip and Talia, is there anything you want to add on to that before we go to the next question? All good. Okay, so I'll pass. Perfect. So this one will actually be might be a little bit more geared to your presentation, but someone asked, are there any studies that you can point me to about the health effects of on-site fossil fuel combustion, and to kind of arm folks with, in the discussion? And I would just add to that, and this is, Talia and Pip, are there any particular things that you all think about and you keep in mind, with regards to the health impacts as you're looking at planning and developing these new all-electric buildings?
Well, I can start at least. I'm not really aware of a study on a building by building basis that talks about health effects of combustion on a building. If you are installing gas-fired equipment in a building, it's going to be pretty efficient and try to get rid of the pollutants up high as much as possible. So I don't know if there's a direct issue that way. But what we were wrestling with for the Quincy Upper School And what I think is maybe the bigger impact is the impact of the environmental air in an area. And that certainly, I would have to find the references to the study and post them. But the work that Tufts University did certainly indicates the health effects, asthma, et cetera, on the people who live in that area, and can have a pretty major effect.
Absolutely. Talia, anything you'd like to add?
Sure. So I guess some people here might be familiar with all of the studies that have come out in terms of cooking using gas in homes. I think that is a good reference point just for the harms of combustion in a space. I would say here in town, we have a gas leaks task force that's working hard on repairs to, or I guess advocating for repairs to gas infrastructure. And I think we don't always place as much in general and place as much import on the effects of those leaks, both for the environment and for humans around them. I think in Arlington, we've also been able to demonstrate that those gas leaks are killing trees. So I think there's something to be said, not just for the combustion in the building, but also for the infrastructure that's going up to the building.
And
Absolutely.
if Talia suggests something else, because there has been a lot of discussion recently about the effects of cooking with gas. So our Quincy School also, we haven't talked about the food service equipment yet, but it's an all-electric kitchen and an all-electric food tech classroom area. So those areas have made the changeover also in order to deal with those impacts.
That is the same for our study as well.
That's excellent. And I know this was going on in the chat, but Sarah, I know you are an abundance of information around studies. So are there any other studies you'd like to point folks to?
Well, hopefully the jumble that Cora put in there for us will work. But yeah, that's exactly the information that's going to be in our forthcoming paper in January. I did just quickly run to that section and pull the main pieces of literature that we cite in that report, so you wouldn't have to wait, because I'm not about making anybody wait. And I think I totally agree with Talia that all the information coming about gas stoves is really a good indicator. When we did research for this report, there were not a lot of studies, any studies actually, that we could point to that really look at the HVAC system specifically. The notion, some people will tell you, well, it's vented. And the idea is you don't have to worry about it. And from my perspective, given that our boilers and our HVAC systems in schools are decades old and desperately in need of repair, I have zero confidence that venting is happening 100% and that there's not leakage into our schools. The other piece I threw in the chat was a report that we did earlier with Heat, identifying from their gas leaks mapping statewide the extent to which their gas leaks that they identified are co-located with school properties. So these are not leaks inside the building, but these are leaks at the school property, basically in the distribution network. And so, again, present risks to students and those schools. And the highlight from that was in 1 year alone, there were 91 school properties where there were gas leaks at the school property in that distribution infrastructure.
Wow. That's really helpful, Sarah. Thank you so much. I want to I see that there are two comments around incentives, so I want to kind of bunch them together, and then I want to talk a little bit about the life cycle analysis that you all have been working, or that you have completed and done in these instances. But before I do, some folks asked about when the GSHP incentive will become available, and similarly, someone asked around what folks know about how schools and municipalities can benefit from the energy efficiency commercial buildings deduction under section 179D. So I assume I'll pass this over to you, Sarah, first, to see if you have a response to either of those questions.
Yeah, so quickly, again, the 30% base is available now. The bonus credits, the 210%, will be available come January 2023. So any projects put into service after January 1, we won't know exactly, we don't have the guidance about exactly how it's going to all come together in terms of the process, but any projects put into service after January 1 will get access to those bonus credits. And then yes, the 179D is also available and newly enriched, so up to $5 a square foot now if you hit a 50% reduction in energy. That needs to be taken, you need to work with a designer on that because they are the ones to actually take the deduction, and then they can theoretically pass and share some of the wealth, but folks like Pip will probably know more about how that's managed.
Yeah, that really states it well, because the school districts are not paying taxes. They can sign over their tax benefits under 179D to the designers, and we would share it between us and our engineers who are responsible for the design. And in some cases, it's really not the intent that it's there's a payback for it, but there have been communities where we have shared some of the tax deduction benefit with the town in terms of a donation. I don't think there's really a way that you're supposed to just give the money directly back, but we have provided some proportion of it as a charitable donation to some portion of the school or the community.
Excellent. Yeah, that's helpful, Pip. Thanks for adding on. I have one final question, and selfishly, this is one that I have for you, Pip, and you, Talia. Both of you mentioned life cycle analysis and that being kind of a critical piece of the puzzle as you're moving forward. And I'm just curious to what extent you all are incorporating embodied carbon into that discussion, the carbon in the walls, if you are, and if you've run into any challenges along the way as you're doing that.
And I can answer quickly that we are not specifically yet with the life cycle analyses that we've done to date, but we're working at it. We're working with ourselves and our engineers to get to that point where embodied carbon, because that's such an important part of the equation. So the life cycle cost analyses that I talked about that we did for Quincy Upper didn't include that at all. But hopefully, as we go forward, we'll begin incorporating that information into our life cycle cost analysis.
I have a similar answer, which is that no, it is unfortunately not included in this study, but I hope that we will be able to consider that going forward. It was simply not in the scope.
Absolutely. Sarah, anything you want to add on to that question? Okay. I think, I think that makes sense. Embodied carbon is really becoming very much so, coming onto the scene, and people are recognizing it more and more as the elephant in the room, and something that absolutely needs to be addressed. So we have about 2 more minutes remaining. So I want to just conclude with 2 quick things. The first is I want to make sure that everyone is aware that we have, what we're talking about today, and the opportunities that are being discussed are really changing the game. But there's no question that we need to continue to move forward. We need to continue to make sure that communities like Arlington, like others who are interested, are continuing to get the resources they need to build out these plans. And so one proposal that MCAN has been working on in partnership with Undaunted K through 12 and 145 other organizations is something called a Zero Carbon Renovation Fund. And this is a request to get $300 million from the remaining ARPA funds to be set aside specifically for the creation of a fund that would enable and kind of specifically incentivize and fund deep energy retrofits in places like affordable housing, schools, other municipal buildings, and environmental justice communities. So Sarah just put that in the chat, but I'd be remiss if I didn't quickly mention that. The second thing that I wanted to just mention, and really as a concluding thought, I just want to thank Pip, you so much, and Talia and Sarah for your incredible expertise and your incredible work with the Quincy School and in Arlington. We're so grateful for everything that's happening on the ground, and so excited to continue to see it move forward. And I also want to thank everyone for joining our call today and for staying till the end. And I hope this was useful. We will, as I mentioned, follow up with all of the resources that we discussed today. And we'll continue working together to ensure that our schools, the place where our children are spending a whole lot of time, are healthy, safe climate protectors. So thank you all so much for joining. We're so grateful for all your work and all your leadership on this issue.
Oh, thank you.
Take care, everyone. Thank you so much.